Good evening and welcome to a very special Memorial Day program. Theater for Ideas is proud to present the poetry of Wilfred Owen, a dramatic presentation. Wilfred Owen was a British poet killed in World War I. This program is much more than about World War I. It is about war. The presentation was adapted and compiled by Mary Brandt, who's joining me here to tell us a little bit more about Wilfred Owen and the presentation. So Mary, welcome to Theater for Ideas.
Thank you. The production was originally presented at Indiana Purdue in order to fulfill the requirements of a graduate oral interpretation class instructed by Dr. Janet Roncelli. And the assignment was to compile material for interpreters theater. And I chose the poetry of Wilfred Owen because it is so dramatic and so rich, and it lended itself very well for this type of production.
How did you go about putting the poems together? Did you read a lot of poems and then just through a process of elimination pick the ones that you thought worked the best?
All of the letters and poems were selected from the book, the collected poems of Wilfred Owen, which is a New Directions publication published by McLaughlin. And I read through that and assembled the poems and letters in chronological order in order to adapt them for the production.
So this has been performed then once or more than once?
We also performed it in September for the Indiana Interpretation Festival.
So 2 times, and the first time was when?
The first one was a year ago, and the last time was in September.
Mary, I'd like to thank you for joining us and for making this stunning presentation available to Theater for Ideas. We're very proud to have it. I'd like to remind the audience and the viewing audience that we will have a discussion following the presentation. And now, the poetry of Wilfred Owen.
This is not about heroes. English poetry is not yet fit to speak of them. Nor is it about lands or deeds, nor anything to do with glory, honor, might, majesty, dominion, or power, except war. Above all, I am not concerned with poetry. My subject is war, and the pity of war. The poetry is in the pity.
4 June 1916. I have just received orders to take the train at a top to join the 2nd Manchesters. This is a regular regiment, so I have come off mighty well. It is a huge satisfaction to be going among well-trained troops and genuine, real old officers. There is a fine heroic feeling about being in France, and I am in perfect spirits. A tinge of excitement is about me, but excitement is always necessary to my happiness.
Down the close, darkening lanes they sang their way to the siding shed, and lined the train with faces grimly gay.
Their breasts were stuck all white with wreath and spray, as men's are, dead.
Dull porters watched them, and a casual tramp stood staring hard, sorry to miss them from the upland camp. Then, unmoved, signals nodded, and a lamp winked to the guard.
So secretly, like wrongs hushed up, they went. They were not ours. We never heard to which front these were sent.
Nor dare if they yet mock what women meant who gave them flowers.
So they returned the beatings of great bells and wild trainloads. A few, too few for drums and yells, may creep back silent to still village wells up half-known roads.
4 January 1917. Since I set foot on Calais Quay, I have not had dry feet. No one knew anything about us on this side, and we might have taken weeks to get here, and must have, but for fighting our way here. At the base, as I said, it was not so bad. We were in the camp of Sir Percy Cunningham. After those days, we were let down gently into the real thing, mud. It has penetrated now into that sanctuary, my sleeping bag, and that holy of holies, my pajamas.
I too saw God through mud, the mud that cracked on cheeks when wretches smiled. War brought more glory to their eyes than blood, and gave their laughs more glee than shakes a child. Merry it was to laugh there where death becomes absurd, and life absurder. For power was on us, and we slashed bones bare, not to feel sickness or remorse of murder. I too have dropped off fear, behind the barrage, dead as my platoon, and sailed my spirit surging light and clear past the entanglement where hopes lay strewn, and witnessed exultation. Faces that used to curse me scowl for scowl, shine and lift up with passion of oblation, seraphic for an hour, though they were foul. I have made fellowships, untold of happy lovers in old song, for love is not the binding of fair lips with the soft silk of eyes that look and long, by joy whose ribbon slips, but wound with war's hard wire whose stakes are strong, bound in the bandage of the arm that drips, knit in the webbing of the rifle thong. I have perceived much beauty in the hoarse oaths that kept our courage straight, heard music in the silentness of duty, found peace where shell storms spouted reddest spate. And nevertheless, except you share with them in hell, the sorrowful dark of hell, whose world is but the trembling of a flare, in heaven but as a highway for a shell. You shall not hear their mirth. You shall not come to think them well content by any jest of mine. These men are worth your tears. You are not worth their merriment.
7 January 1917. It is afternoon. We had an inspection to make from 9 to 12 this morning. I have wandered into a village cafe where they gave me writing paper. We made a redoubtable march yesterday from the last camp to this. The state of the roads and the awful enormous weight carried was too much for scores of men. Officers also carried full packs, but I had a horse part of the way. It was beginning to freeze through the rain when we arrived at our tents. We were at the mercy of the cold, and being in health, I never suffered so terribly yesterday afternoon. I am really quite well, but have sensations kindred to being seriously ill. As I was making my damp bed, I heard the guns for the first time. It was a sound not without a certain sublimity.
Our brains ache in the merciless ice east winds that knife us. Wearied, we keep awake because the night is silent. Low, drooping flares confuse our memory of the salient. Worried by silence, sentries whisper, curious, nervous, but nothing happens.
Watching, we hear the mad gusts tugging on the wire, like twitching agonies of men among its brambles. Northward, incessantly, the flickering gunner fumbles, far off, like a dull rumor of some other war. What are we doing here?
The poignant misery of dawn begins to grow. We only know that war lasts, rain soaks, and clouds sag stormy. Dawn amassing in the east her melancholy army, attacks once more in ranks on ranks of shivering gray. But nothing happens.
Sudden, successive flights of bullets streak the silence. Less deathly than the air that shudders black with snow, with sidelong flowing flakes that flock, pause, and renew. We watch them, wandering up and down the wind's nonchalance. But nothing happens.
Pale flakes with fingering stealth come feeling for our faces. We cringe in holes, back on forgotten dreams, and stare, snow-dazed, deep into grassier ditches. So we doze, snow-dazed, littered with blossoms, trickling where the blackbird fusses. Is it that we are dying?
Slowly our ghosts drag home, glimpsing the sunk fires glozed with crusted dark red jewels. Crickets jingle there. For hours the innocent mice rejoice. The house is theirs. Shutters and doors are closed. On us the doors are closed. We turn back to our dying.
Since we believe not otherwise can kind fires burn, nor ever sun smile true on child or field or fruit, for God's invincible spring, our love is made afraid. Therefore, not loath, we lie out here. Therefore, we're born, for love of God seems dying.
Tonight, his frost will fasten on this mud and us, shriveling many hands, puckering foreheads crisp. The burying party, picks and shovels in their shaking grasp, pause at half-known faces. All their eyes are ice. But nothing happens.
7 January 1917. This morning I have been reading trench standing orders to my platoon. Needless to say, I show a cheerier face to them than I wear in writing this letter. But I must not disguise from you the fact that we are at one of the worst parts of the line. I can't tell you any more facts. I have no fancies and no feelings. Positively, they went numb with my feet. Love is not quenched except the unenduring flickerings thereof. Red lips are not so red as the stained stones kissed by the English dead. Kindness of wooed and wooer seems shame to their love pure. O love, your eyes lose lure when I behold eyes blinded in my stead. Your slender attitude trembles not, exquisite like limbs knife skewed, rolling and rolling there where God seems not to care, till the fierce love they bear cramps them in death's extreme decrepitude. Your voice sings not so soft, though even as wind murmuring through raftered loft. Your dear voice is not dear, gentle, and evening clear as theirs whom none now hear. Now earth has stopped their piteous mouths that coughed. Heart, you were never hot, nor large, nor full like hearts made great with shot. And though your hand be pale, paler are all which trail your cross through flame and hail. Weep. You may weep, for you may touch them not.
January 1917. I can see no excuse for deceiving you about these last few days. I have suffered seventh hell. We had a march of 3 miles. It was, of course, dark, too dark. And the ground was not mud, not sloppy mud, but an octopus of sucking clay, 2, 3, and 4 feet deep. Relieved by craters of water. Men have been known to drown in them. High explosives were dropping all around, and machine guns spluttered every few minutes. My dugout held 25 men tightly packed. Water filled it to a depth of 1 or 2 feet, say, leaving 4 feet of air. Those 50 hours were the agony of my happy life.
Ever again to breathe pure happiness, the happiness our mother gave us boys, to smile at nothings needing no caress. Have we not laughed too often since with joys? Have we not wrought too sick and sorrowful wrongs for her hand's pardoning? Oh, the sun may cleanse in time and starlight. Life will sing sweet songs. And God's will give us pleasure more than men's. Yet heaven looks smaller than the old doll's home. No nestling place is left in the bluebell bloom, and the side arms of trees lost their scope. Former happiness is unreturning. Boys' griefs are no more grievous than our longing. Boys have no sadness, sadder than our hope.
14 May 1917. Then we were caught in a tornado of shells. When I looked back and saw the ground all crawling and wormy with wounded bodies, I felt no horror at all, but only an immense exultation at having got through the barrage. He sat in a wheeled chair waiting for dark and shivered in his ghastly suit of gray, legless, sewn short at elbow. In the park, voices of boys rang saddening like a hymn, voices at play and pleasure after day, till gathering sleep had mothered them from him. About this time, town used to swing so gay, when glow lamps budded in the light blue trees, and girls glanced lovelier as the air grew dim in the old times, before he threw away his knees. Now he will never again feel how slim girls' waists are, or how soft their subtle hands. All of them touch him like some queer disease. There was an artist silly for his face, for it was younger than his youth last year. Now he is old. His back will never brace. He's lost his color very far from here, poured it down shell holes till the veins ran dry, and half his lifetime lapsed in the hot race, and leap of purple spurted from his thigh. One time he liked a blood smear down his leg, after the matches carried shoulder high. It was after football, when he'd drunk a peg, he thought he'd better join. He wonders why. Someone had said he'd look a god in kilts. That's why. And maybe, too, to please his Meg. Aye, that was it. To please the giddy jilts he asked to join. He didn't have to beg. Smiling, they wrote his lie, aged 19 years. Germans he scarcely thought of. All their guilts and Austrias did not move him, and no fear of fears came yet. He thought of jeweled hilts for daggers and plaid socks, of smart salutes, of care of arms and leave and pay arrears, esprit de corps and hits for young recruits. And soon he was drafted out with drums and cheers. Some cheered him home, but not as crowds cheer goal. Only a solemn man who brought him fruits thanked him, and then inquired about his soul. Now he will spend a few sick years in institutes, and do what things the rules consider wise, and take whatever pity they may dole. Tonight he noticed how the women's faces passed from him to the strong men that were home. How cold and late it is. Why don't they come and put him into bed? Why don't they come?
July 1917. Already I have comprehended a light which will never filter into the dogma of any national church. Namely, that one of Christ's essential commands was passivity at any price. Suffer dishonor and disgrace, but never resort to arms. Be bullied, be outraged, be killed, but do not kill. It may be chimerical and an ignominious principle, but there it is. It can only be ignored. And I think pulpit professionals are ignoring it very skillfully and successfully indeed. And am I not a complete conscientious objector with a very secured conscience? Christ is literally in no man's land. These men often hear his voice. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for a friend. It is spoken in English only. In French, I do not believe so. Thus you can see how Christianity will not fit in with pure patriotism.
One ever hangs where shelled roads part. In this war, he too lost a limb. But his disciples hide apart, and now the soldiers bear with him. Near Golgotha strolls many a priest, and on their faces there is pride that they were flesh-marked by the beast, by whom the gentle Christ's denied. The scribes on all the people shove and brawl allegiance to the state. But they who love the greater love lay down their life. They do not hate.
So the Church Christ was hid and buried under its rubbish and its rubble. In cellars, packed up saints lie serried, well out of hearing of our trouble. One virgin, still immaculate, smiles forth for war to smile upon her. She's haloed with an old tin hat, but a piece of hell will batter her.
15 September 1917. I feel my own life all the more precious and more dear in the presence of the deflowering of Europe. While it is true that the guns will effect a little useful weeding, I am furious with chagrin to think that the minds, which were to have excelled the civilization of 2,000 years, are being annihilated, and bodies, the product of eons of national selection, melted down to pay for political statues.
Jesus Christ! I'm hit,
He said, and died. Whether he vainly cursed or prayed indeed, the bullets chirped in vain, vain, vain. Machine guns chuckled tut to tut, and the big gun guffawed. Another sighed.
Mother? Mother? Dad?
Then smiled at nothing, childlike, being dead. And the lofty shrapnel cloud leisurely gestured, fool, and the falling splinters tittered.
my love.
One moaned. Love languid seemed his mood, till, slowly lowered, his whole face kissed the mud, and the bayonet's long teeth grinned. Rabbles of shells hooted and groaned, and the gas hissed 31 December 1917. And so I have come to the true measure of man. I am not dissatisfied with my years. Everything has been done in bouts. Bouts of awful labor at Shrewsbury and Bordeaux. Bouts of amazing pleasure in the Pyrenees and play at Craglockhart. Bouts of religion at Dunsdon. Bouts of horrible danger on the Somme. Bouts of poetry always, of your affection always, of sympathy for the oppressed always. I go out of this year a poet, my dear mother, as which I did not enter it. I am held peer by the Georgians. I am a poet's poet. I am started. The tugs have left me. I feel the great swelling of the open sea taking my galleon. Last year at this time, it is just midnight, and now is the intolerable instant of change. Last year, I lay awake in a windy tent in the middle of a vast, dreadful encampment. It seemed neither France nor England, but a kind of paddock where the beasts are kept a few days before the shambles. I heard the reveling of the Scotch troops, who are now dead, and who knew they would be dead. I thought of this present night, and whether I should indeed, whether we should indeed, whether you would indeed. But I thought neither long nor deeply, for I am a master of elision. But chiefly I thought of the very strange look on all the faces in that camp, an incomprehensible look, which a man will never see in England, though wars should be in England, nor can it be seen in any battle, but only in Etaples.
Bent double like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs and toward our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched to sleep. Many had lost their boots but limped on, bloodshod. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of tired, outstripped 5-9s that dropped behind. Gas. Gas. Quick, boys, an ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time, but someone still was floundering and stumbling as a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. In all my dreams before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing on his face, his hanging face like a devil sick of sin. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile incurable sores on innocent tongues. My friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children, ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie. Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori.
It was not despair or terror. It was more terrible than terror, for it was a blindfold look, and without expression, like a dead rabbit's. It will never be painted, and no actor will ever seize it. And to describe it, I think I must go back and be with them.
Out there, we've walked quite friendly up to death.
Sat down and eaten with him, cool and bland.
pardon them spilling mess tins in our hands.
Oh, we sniffed the green, thick odor of his breath.
Our eyes wept, but our courage didn't rise.
He spat at us with bullets, and he's coughed.
Shrapnel. We chorused when he sang aloft.
We whistled while he shaved us with his sigh.
Oh, death was never an enemy of ours.
We laughed at him, we leagued with him, old chum.
No soldier paid to kick against his powers.
We laughed knowing that better men would come.
And greater wars.
When each proud fighter brags,
He wars on death for lives.
not men, for flags.
31 October 1918. The battalion had a sheer time last week. I can find no better epithet, because I cannot say I suffered anything, having let my brain grow dull. That is to say, my nerves are in perfect order, though the boy at my side, shot through the head, lay on top of me, soaking my shoulder for half an hour. Catalog? Photograph? Can you photograph the crimson hot iron as it cools from the smelting? That is what Joan's blood looked like and felt like. My senses are charred. I came out in order to help these boys.
4 November 1918.
Wilfred Owen died in combat.
11 November 1918. World War I came to an end.
Move him into the sun. Gently its touch awoke him once, at home, whispering of fields unsown. Always it woke him, even in France, until this morning and this snow. If anything might rouse him now, the kind old sun will know. Think how it wakes the seeds, woke once the clays of a cold star. Our limbs, so dear achieved, our sides, full-nerved, still warm, too hard to stir. Was it for this the clay grew tall? What made fetch with sunbeams toil? To break earth's sleep at all?
This is not about heroes.
Down the close, darkening lanes,
I too saw God through mud.
our brains ache in the merciless.
Red lips are not so red.
Ever again to see pure
He
happiness.
sat in a wheelchair,
In this war, he too.
Oh, Jesus Christ, I'm hit!
bent double like old beggars under sacks.
Dulce et decorum est, pro patria more.
To die for one's country is sweet and proper.
The Poetry of Wilfred Owen with Jean Hansen Cox, Dana Charette, and Harvey Cox. Stunning. Thank you so much. We will now have a discussion, and it will be led by Mike Lewis. Mike has been on a Theater for Idea panel. He has the honor of being the first repeater of our new series, and Dana Charette from the cast. Dana, welcome to our discussion, and Mike.
Thank you.
Mike, you also, of course, were a veteran in the Vietnam War. I'd like to begin by saying that in addition to being a soldier, you also are a very accomplished and talented poet, and we read and used some of your poetry on our other show about the Vietnam vets. I'd like to begin by asking you how you got from there, from a soldier to a poet. What happened? What was that transition?
I think probably the
the experience of the war itself brought the poetry out in myself. I think this is also an indicator at this time in our society right now where the numbers of Vietnam vets who are, shall we say, haunted by the ghost of the war are using not necessarily poetry, but art as a form to exorcise this ghost. It's working for me, and it is working for other people. And I think perhaps all things considered that the intensity of the war experience is the thing that has triggered the poet in myself, so to speak.
Well, I know that quite a few of the members, or at least the men who go to the Vet Center, are poets or writing novels. I know you're writing a novel now.
Yes, this is so.
We mentioned at the beginning of the program that this is not, of course, a presentation about World War I, World War II, the Vietnam conflict. It is about war. One of the things that came through so clearly in the presentation was the explosion of all the myths, sweet and proper to die for one's country, the thing about death. Were you aware of these things when you went into battle, or at least when you were first going into the Vietnam War?
Well, yes. I think Wilfred Owen's poetry brings out very graphically the feeling of young men, their invulnerability, and their approach to war. Myself, in connection with the war, I saw myself as enthused about the war, as going there to fulfill a purpose. As we take the last quote, in terms of dying for one's country, I think that at this point in time, that if you talk with many of the veterans in society now, that many of them will say that yes, dying for one's country, of course, is patriotic and sweet and so forth.
How do you think that art becomes involved with war? I remember one of your poems, The Warrior's Ecstasy, where these myths were just exploded in your poetry, the disillusionment. It is not a heroic thing to do, it is a stupid thing to do. You're going to die. You now mentioned earlier how it is kind of a release for these men that you know to write poetry. What can we learn from something like Wilfred Owen? I mean, that the relationship between art and social issues, in this case, of course, poetry and war.
Well, the thing I think that Wilfred Owen was trying to show us is the horror of war, which of course is difficult to do in words or in art form, and the best we can do is attempt to do so. Well, let's take this a bit further. I believe in the future that we will have to learn from war in terms of art. I think that our society today is so calloused in terms of the hard life we live, the trauma of the last war that we were in, that somehow we're going to have to convey to the coming generations, the coming generation in particular, who is going to be responsible for the country, somehow this youth is going to have to be shown the trauma and the things that can happen from war, how it, of course, will upset the country, and the personal trauma that's involved. Art may be one of the last vectors of information transfer that we have.
Okay. Do you think then that art, say the poetry, this presentation of Wilfred Owen, would be a proper way to introduce young men to war? It's rarely done. I mean, and I guess that's the point we're getting at. Dana, feel free to join in here.
I feel a very strong sense of urgency of wars with a cute little phrase, conventional weapons. And we accept that as a cute little phrase these days, conventional weapons. That's cute. We can still kill millions of people with conventional weapons. But for war with conventional weapons to do that and kill lots of folk And it is murder, let's face it, you know. You have to get a lot of people involved. You have to have a population willing to wage war. Unfortunately, we have other weapons other than conventional weapons. And instead of getting a large mass of people, a vast majority to say, all right, let's go do this thing, we now have the control of war with nuclear weapons in the hands of a very few people. So I feel a very strong urgency about that.
Mike, when you were following up on what Dane is saying about the conventional weapons, the horror war that we're to the point where we can blow ourselves up, when you were in Vietnam, were you writing poetry then? Was this something that you started experiencing during the war, or was it something you got back to the States and you thought, my God, what was that I was doing? What was I involved in over there?
Well, it happens both ways, at least with myself. In a traumatic situation, a life or death situation where your whole being is heightened to almost its ultimate, your reactions, the whole thing. I would liken that situation to many artistic, creative endeavors within myself. You're heightened to that point, and whether it be a life or death situation or whether you're creating one or the other, these things tend to flow into the same sort of level. And with this in mind, I think that yes, some of the things I did were done there. They were conceived, so to speak. And other things which, when you're in those battle situations, you tend to put out of your mind. So after you've returned, and let's say you have lowered your whole being to an acceptable level of society, other thoughts and emotions begin to flow that you weren't aware of, and of course these stimulate a different type of reaction and a different type of poetry for myself. But yes, both situations.
I sometimes wonder if an art form itself is strong enough. A lot of times you have peer pressure. I noticed, I went to Vietnam also, and I had a lot of peer pressure from the people that I associated with, the family, my folks, and all the people I grew up with and had as role models, all the people who've been in the big one, WW2. And there was a sense of, well, this is a good thing to do. You know, of course, it's a nasty war, but this is something that our country is asking of us. And I also wanted the GI Bill, so I was pretty well into that too. We all sell ourselves for something somewhere, I guess.
What do you hope comes from a performance like this, Dan?
Well, see, my brother and sister-in-law introduced me to Wilfred Owen before I was ever in the service, and I took a copy of Wilfred Owen's collected poems with me over there. And I had thought of myself as somewhat of a poet too at one time, and I just had no tongue when it came to writing some of the things down. And I don't know, I guess it was that how profoundly well done I think Wilfred Owen's poetry is. And it's in a class totally by itself, and I felt very inadequate to even try to attempt writing anything about it. After coming back from overseas, I helped form a couple of theater troupes, and we did anti-war poetry and joined the anti-war movement and got very much involved in that. But
I'd like to remind the audience, if you'd like to contribute an idea to the discussion, we'd be more than happy to hear it. Mike, following up again on what you've been saying, do you think that war itself is some kind of release for young men?
Very definitely, especially with Americans. We've been brought up, of course, with the John Wayne image, and we're going through a situation now in our society where that image is incapable of being fulfilled, since we have no draft or have no hot war, so to speak. And this will have implications in the future with essentially the next generation of, as we see it, castrated men.
What then can, going back to the original question, what can art do to about this, if anything? You know, Dana, you mentioned that you had the poetry of Wilfred Owen right there in Vietnam with you. If we were to present this kind of presentation, a very stunning enactment of the horrors of war, do you think that that would have any effect on these men that you're talking about wanting to get this John Wayne image and, you know, be a man through battle and war?
Well, I think that it's certainly worth a try. I think we're going to have to do something. It's a bit hard to gauge the nation's mental state at this time, but without a doubt, art is going to play a part in the future, especially with the outpouring of the artistic endeavors of the current group of veterans, the Vietnam veterans.
Well, I know that there's much talk these days about the Vietnam Vet Centers, about whether they should be funded, funding being cut back, the need for Vietnam veterans to get together to understand what they did. If this presentation were to be performed, would it be beneficial to veterans who are trying to come to grips with themselves? In other words, what way can art, in a practical, very positive sense, affect our decisions and the way we think about each other and ourselves?
Well, yes, I think that a performance of this magnitude and power would be quite effective in terms of vets. I also think that were performances like this introduced, say, into the school systems, where there was a good exposure to these sort of things, that yes, it would help the upcoming group of leaders, so to speak, to understand things a little bit better. It would be difficult, as perceiving any war experience always is, but nonetheless, I think that we have the obligation there.
Well, I ask that because the conventional way of dealing with these kinds of problems is through workshops and seminars and things like that. And I was just wondering if it might not be effective to use some poetry like this from time to time in actual group settings. I know, are you not a master degree in psychology, is that correct? From that perspective, do you think it would be helpful?
Well, yes, I do. In the groups, the problem, of course, with Vietnam vets as a group is the fact they don't trust anybody. And not to get off on the Vietnam War, but the percentage of veterans that you see on going to the vet centers is very small compared to the overall group of veterans that have the problem with the ghost of the war. But yes, there's no doubt that artistic performances will help.
Dana, you mentioned the peer pressure. We saw in the 60s, and I know you were very active in the 60s with the street theater that you mentioned, we saw the way that art was used to really become a hymn to our youth through the music of Bob Dylan, Peter, Paul, and Mary, other people, but particularly Bob Dylan. That music, I think, kind of united a whole feeling and gave voice to this whole anti-war movement. And I think it had a profound effect on this country. And in that respect, I think it's been documented that art can move people to a different direction. Poetry is more subtle in the sense you don't have the music in it with it, and I guess you don't maybe have as much excitement for that peer pressure you were mentioning, Dana, for all, thousands of people to come together. Nonetheless, I found this performance so stunning that I would find it difficult to believe that somebody could see that and still think of war in the same way that they did before they saw it. We also have other examples, Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, where works of art have profoundly affected the society.
I kind of wonder, I kind of have, sometimes I can look, started 4 times already. It can be very gloomy when you look at the human race through history. It can be very gloomy indeed when you think of some of the great human beings that have lived and have contributed significantly to how we are alive today, how we deal in terms of each other in our society and our religion and our culture and all that stuff. And I keep wondering why, if these people with their magnificent voices a Moses or a Christ. How come when Moses would preach law and, you know, a whole thing of thou shalt not kill, or then you'd have Christ saying turn the other cheek. And these are people who had a voice that I'm a very humble human being. I couldn't hope to even match their voice. What kind of a voice do we have as artists? Another thing is, what kind of a risk do we run making our lifestyles heroic? In other words, oh, I see. War is a good thing if you go to it and come back and are against it. And that's, it can get very complicated and very complex how someone is going to perceive the Wilfred Owen poetry. Wilfred Owen himself, and there's a biography on Wilfred Owen, several of them. He had a chance not to go back to the front. He had been wounded and had been sent back to England, and he had a chance not to go back to the front. Part of one of the letters says something about, I must go back and be with them. A fellow poet and friend, Siegfried Sasson, who was also an anti-war poet, told Wilfred, he said, if you want to really be the effective voice of this thing, you'll have to go back. And so Wilfred Owen did, and I don't know if we went too fast with it, but he was killed the 4th of November, 1918, and the 11th of November, 1918, 7 days later, the war ended. And
how was it that he came to be involved in the war? Just by no choice? He was drafted, or did he feel this was something he had to do?
From what I recall in her biography, he joined, but it probably would have been a matter of time before he was drafted anyway. The war had been going on for about a year and a half, and he joined, as a matter of fact, the Artists' Rifles.
How apropos.
We just have a few moments left. Mike, is there anything you'd like to say in wrapping up?
Well, I would encourage the audience here to, of course, visit the Vet Center and find out what's going on with the current group of veterans and their artwork, and, of course, encourage artwork in terms of relating war to our current life, and think that having a look at the East with the oil situation, Ireland, the whole thing, that this simply is something we cannot avoid any further. We have to deal with war.
I want to say something real quick about all this, and it's like I remember very vividly. I was in college when President Kennedy was assassinated, and I remember just how wretchedly horrible that event was. I was in Vietnam when Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy were both assassinated. And then we have attempts on President Ford when he was president. We have, in most recent past, something we all are very aware of. Our current president was wounded, and we have a pope who has been wounded on this earth. It's got to stop. Just must stop. We have this whole bang bang shoot 'em up business is baloney. It's got to stop. It's got to stop now. It's suicide.
Mike, where do you hope to go with your art? What would you hope that your novel that you're writing does for us?
Well, it carries a message, the horrors of war, particularly bringing home the war. It's been traumatic for me, those around me, and I hope that my efforts will enlighten the public, so to speak. That is my basic desire with the book.
Thank you. Mike Lewis, poet, novelist, former soldier in Vietnam, and Dana Charette, actor and former soldier in Vietnam. Thank you both so much for joining us for our discussion. Dana, thank you again for being part of that stunning presentation. And what can you say after a presentation like that except to ask the question, is the pen mightier than the sword? And hope that we can all work together to make that answer a resounding yes. From the Allen County Public Library, thank you all. I'm Terry Doran. Good night.